The smell hits me before I turn the key. That mix of sour milk and dust, a scent that lingers in folds of clothing and behind the wallpaper, like something that never agreed to die. Every Sunday, I come here, not out of obligation, not quite out of care. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's a rehearsal. Apartment 3B hasn't changed since I started visiting Harold 2 years ago. The hallway is still crowded with those plastic walkers with rusted brakes, the rubber tennis balls worn to nubs. The door opens slower now, as if even the hinges are tired of holding on. Inside, time is disjointed. The walls wear the same coats of nicotine-stained paint, layered like sediment, each layer trying to forget the one beneath it, and the air is dense with the weight of things unsaid. Harold doesn't speak much, but when he does, he names ghosts. Dolores, he'll call out suddenly, halfway through his lukewarm oatmeal. Marvin, that you? You left your comb again. He speaks into corners like they're windows. He reaches out, not expecting answers, just the comfort of the motion. There is a rhythm to his delusion, a grace in the way he dances with absence. I used to correct him, tell him Marvin was dead, Dolores too, but I stopped, not because I stopped caring, but because I stopped needing to be right. Truth has a cruel sharpness in rooms like this. His apartment is a museum curated by neglect. A bra hangs from a ceiling fan that hasn't spun in years. Melted pill bottles line the edge of the sink like molted skin. The coffee table is a reliquary frayed coasters, dried orange peels, a remote that hasn't worked since analog died, and then there's the photograph. His wife June, in a lavender dress, leaning into a younger Harold with that sort of trust people used to believe in. He talks about her sometimes, not as if she's gone, but as if she's in the other room, brushing her hair. She had that long brush with the ivory handle, he said once, made the sound of wind when she pulled it through. I don't correct that either. Most weeks, I bring groceries, bananas he never eats, soup cans he stacks but doesn't open. Once I found 17 of them in the oven, dusty with neglect. I took them out and didn't say a word. We sat in silence while the news flickered on the television, the volume too low for comprehension, just enough to simulate presence. Sometimes I wonder why I come. He doesn't know my name, calls me Ned or Doctor, though I'm neither. Once he called me son, and I didn't correct him then either. Maybe it's a form of selfishness, staring into the cracked mirror of his life to see what I might become. Or maybe it's guilt, inherited or otherwise. When I leave, I always pause at the door. That smell, milk curdled into fabric, dust soaked into wood, follows me into the hallway. I carry it home like a warning, or maybe like a whisper. There's a difference between being forgotten and being gone. Harold teaches me that every Sunday, but I haven't yet decided which is lonelier. It was the 8th Sunday of spring when the silence changed texture. I'd arrived like I always did, bag of groceries in one hand, half-hearted resolve in the other, but this time the door was ajar, just a crack, barely enough to notice unless you knew the sound it made when it latched. I paused, let my breath sit heavy in my chest, and knocked gently anyway. No answer. I pushed it open. The air had a different kind of weight, not just must and spoiled dairy, but something colder, thinner. The light in the room looked blanched, as if even the sun had lost interest. Harold wasn't in his usual place, the recliner that sagged like a frown. For the first time in years, the television was off. The room had no heartbeat. Harold, I called out. Nothing. Then, from the bedroom, a noise, a thud, like a dropped book or a collapsing certainty. I found him on the floor, one leg curled under him like a question mark. His hands trembled in soft, looping arcs as he tried to push himself up, but the rest of his body had already surrendered. A pool of something dark and viscous shimmered beside his elbow. Coffee, I hoped. When he saw me, he blinked with that murky recognition reserved for dreams. June, he said, almost smiling. No, Harold, it's me. I lifted him gently, bones light as sticks, and settled him into the recliner. His skin felt papery, heatless. There was blood on the cuff of his sweater. He'd clipped his arm on the door frame, he told me later, trying to find the brush. The one with the ivory handle, she always kept it on the nightstand. He stared into space, into some tender memory, and I knew the pain wasn't from the fall. I cleaned the wound. We didn't speak. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Outside, children played a game involving chalk and screaming. Their joy felt like graffiti on a gravestone. That night, I stayed longer than usual, cooked him soup. I knew he wouldn't finish. I sat across from him and watched as he sipped with the exaggerated care of someone trying not to wake a sleeping world. His eyes kept drifting toward the hallway, listening. She's gone, you know, he said suddenly, His voice was small and mechanical, like a wind-up toy on its last crank. But sometimes I still hear her humming, that song she liked, about the lilacs. He looked at me then, really looked. Isn't it strange how a person can be dead for years and still walk louder than the living? I didn't have an answer. I rarely do in his presence. The rules of logic and comfort don't operate here. He fell asleep mid-sentence, spoon still hovering near his lips. I took it gently from his hand and placed it back in the bowl. I cleaned up in silence, as if moving too loudly might wake something not meant to return. On my way out, I paused at the photo of June again. Her eyes, though printed and fading, always seemed to follow you. Not accusing, not sad, just watching, bearing witness. In the hallway, the door clicked shut behind me with the weight of something more permanent. I stood there for a long time, longer than usual. The air smelled the same. Milk, dust, and now a trace of copper. I realized, with a tight pull in my chest, that Harold was closer to gone than forgotten, and that made all the difference. But what do we do with someone else's ending, when we've been reading their story from the margins all along? There are some silences that stay with you, crawl under your skin and nest there. After Harold's fall, something shifted in me, though I couldn't name it then. Maybe it was the way he called for June, with such unwavering certainty. Maybe it was the blood, or the way the room seemed to exhale in relief when he fell asleep, as if holding him up had taken its toll. I started dreaming of his apartment. In the dreams, I'd walk in and find it emptied of furniture, walls bare and echoing. The photograph of June was always there, though, face down on the floor, frame cracked. I'd pick it up, but her face would be missing, scraped clean by time. Sometimes the air would hum, that song about lilacs, and I'd wake up tasting dust. I told myself I was imagining things, but I began noticing how his voice grew softer each visit, how his weight in the recliner seemed less corporeal. He was thinning, not in body, but in presence, as if he were becoming more memory than man. Sometimes he wouldn't speak at all, just watched me with a kind of quiet suspicion, like he was trying to remember who I'd been to him in a different life. And I hated how it made me feel. I'd leave his place and walk the neighborhood for hours, trying to outrun a grief that didn't even belong to me. There was something obscene about mourning someone still breathing, but that's exactly what it felt like. At night, I began scanning my own apartment with new eyes. The aging wallpaper in the kitchen looked too familiar. The clutter on my coffee table, bills, unopened mail, a crusted-over mug, seemed like harbingers. I thought of how easy it would be to slide into that kind of decay, how seductively slow the erosion must feel when it's wrapped in routine. One evening, I caught myself talking aloud in the kitchen, asking no one if they'd seen my keys. My voice sounded foreign, like it belonged to the man next door. I stood frozen for minutes, listening to the echo. There was no answer, but the silence felt expectant, like it was waiting for me to understand something I wasn't ready to see. The following Sunday, Harold didn't open the door right away. I knocked again, louder, still nothing. I thought maybe I'd missed a week, or maybe I'd only imagined the last visit. When the door finally creaked open, it wasn't Harold, it was a nurse, early 30s, clipboard in hand, polite but uninterested. She said Harold had been moved to assisted care the day before. He fell again, she explained, eyes flicking past me. Neighbors said they heard him crying for his wife. I nodded, swallowing something dry and sharp. She handed me a box. Harold's things. No family listed, she said, shrugging. The box was light. Inside, the photograph of June, one yellowed sock, a pair of glasses missing one lens, and a note scribbled in uneven handwriting, "Don't forget the lilacs." I took it home and set it on my kitchen table, sat there a long time staring at it. Everything felt too quiet. It occurred to me then, I had become the only person who still remembered Harold as something other than a file in a system. His absence wasn't just physical, it had leaked into me, a slow infection of relevance fading. I'd thought I was visiting him to stave off his isolation, but maybe I'd been trying to make sense of my own. For a week after Harold's removal, I didn't sleep through the night. Every sound in my apartment felt amplified, pipes moaning like regret, the fridge humming its monotony, the tick of the wall clock like a slow metronome marking the decline of everything I never said. I tried to distract myself, read old books, watched television on mute, stood by the window with coffee gone cold, but everything reminded me of Harold, or worse, of what I would one day become. On the 7th night, I found myself outside the assisted living facility. I told myself I'd just see where it was, but something in me was unraveling, frayed by silence and memory, and the thought of Harold navigating that sterile maze alone made something inside me fracture. The receptionist, a young woman with dead eyes and a polite tone, told me he wasn't receiving visitors. He's not lucid, she said. He talks mostly to shadows. I said I wasn't a visitor. I said I was a neighbor, but she looked at me like that word didn't mean anything anymore. I left without seeing him. Back home, I opened the box he'd left behind. The photo of June stared up at me again, her smile frozen mid-trust. I turned it over, hoping for something, an inscription, a date, anything, but there was nothing. Just the texture of cardboard and absence. I set it next to my own childhood photo on the shelf and hated how they looked together, both worn, both telling a story that only one person still remembered. The next day, I walked my hallway with a rag and a bucket, wiping down the places where Harold's hands had lingered, the light switch near his door, the corner of the banister where he leaned, the dent in the wall where his walker once tapped. I did it without thinking. It wasn't cleansing, it was mourning. I began leaving notes in the mailbox of 3B. Not for Harold, he was beyond them now, but for myself. Fragments, thoughts, remember to keep the television too loud. Don't let the dust win. Lilacs bloom even after. The building superintendent eventually cleared out 3B.
So I asked for one thing, the brush with the ivory handle. He let me take it, said it creeped him out anyway. I placed it next to June's photograph and wondered if it had really made the sound of wind.
Then, one morning, I didn't wake in my bed, but in the recliner, my own identical imposture to Harold's. Sunlight came in hard through the blinds, and for a second, just a second, I forgot where I was. I looked around and everything seemed too still. I called out, "June," without meaning to, my voice catching in a way that made me flinch. I didn't know a June, but the name came so easily. It was then I understood. I hadn't been afraid of Harold dying. I'd been afraid of vanishing in place, of fading without notice, without ceremony, becoming a story no one needed to finish reading. I was watching my own outline blur, bit by bit, and Harold had only been the mirror that made it visible. Legacy isn't made of grand gestures. It's in the way someone remembers your voice in an empty room, the weight of your footsteps in the carpet. I started humming that song Harold mentioned, the one about lilacs. I didn't know the words, but the melody came to me anyway, like a faint thread back through time, and I wondered, as I sat there, who would one day call out my name, and mean it. It's been 3 months since Harold died. No obituary, no service, just a line item in the assisted care log and a room cleared out before sunset. I called the facility to ask what happened, and a voice not cruel, just practiced, told me it was peaceful. That word again, peaceful, as if erasure could ever be serene. I visited his grave once. A patch of grass with a marker no bigger than a book. The stone read Harold T. 1928, 2025. No last name, no epitaph, not even the word beloved. Just data, bare and dry. The ground was uneven around the edges, as if the earth itself had second thoughts. I brought him lilacs. They didn't last long. The wind took most of the petals within the hour. Still I stayed, talked to him, or maybe to myself. "I still smell you," I said aloud. "That mixture of sour and memory still lingers in my coat." I've kept his photograph of June. It rests on my shelf beside the ivory brush and the note, "Don't forget the lilacs." Sometimes I look at it and imagine the sounds of her brushing her hair, the wind whistle he once described. I imagine her leaning into Harold again, not because he's remembered, but because she never really left. Lately, I've started a ritual. On Sundays, I visit someone else, an old woman down the block whose husband died in '92. She plays the piano with hands that shake. Sometimes she forgets what year it is. Sometimes she calls me Michael, her son, who moved to Arizona and hasn't written in 5 years. I don't correct her. We talk, or we don't. I bring her bananas and soup she doesn't eat. I sit beside her while she watches the television on mute. It's not Harold's apartment, but the smell is close. And I realize something, what we call decay, isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just memory, finding a softer surface to rest on. A place where names don't need to be remembered, only felt. Where a photograph, a song, a spoon lifted mid-sentence can mean more than any funeral ever could. I find myself humming that tune more often. The one about lilacs. Still don't know the lyrics. Still don't want to. There's something sacred about holding only the melody. Like a secret you carry not to keep, but to feel. Maybe legacy isn't about being remembered in full. Maybe it's about becoming a pattern in someone else's routine. A gesture, a smell, a pause at a door before turning the key. Harold didn't fade quietly. He echoed. He carved a groove into my Sundays, into my sense of time, into the corner of my hallway that still catches dust, the same way his did. I used to think the saddest thing was being forgotten. But now I wonder, Maybe the real ache lies in being half remembered, lingering as a blur at the edge of someone's thought, a name almost spoken, a presence half felt. And so I ask you, when the last person who knows your face is gone, what sound will you make in the silence that follows?